Will the township clerk please read the statement?
This is a special workshop meeting of the Township Council for Friday, April 29th, 2016. Adequate notice of this meeting is provided to the public and the press on April 15th, 2016. It was posted on the bulletin board in the municipal building in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, NJSA 10:4-7. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss the municipal source system. Official action will not be taken.
Roll call.
Councilmember Murphy?
Here.
Councilmember Holmes?
Here.
Councilmember Rizzuto?
Here.
Councilmember Wetzel?
Here.
Council President Kadesh.
Here. Please rise to salute the flag. I
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May I have a motion to open the floor to the public for public comments?
Motion. Second.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Yes, Gary.
Good morning, Gary Martinson. Thank you for having SEC TV here. That's great. We hold our camera down, but now we don't have to use it.
Well, thank Larry
And
for doing it.
excuse me, after I'm done, I have to leave because I have a business, so I have to get back. It's not because I'm not caring about what you're doing. I'd like to suggest that while reviewing contracts is good, the township needs to be reviewing much more, including the premises and the numbers that were part of the contracts that got us to this point. The total build-out of the town center, and these are rounded numbers, is supposed to be 99,000 gallons of sewer flow. The actual existing flow, when this was being initially researched, was 43.5 thousand gallons, a 55.5 thousand difference or shortfall. I say a shortfall because today we have a CVS that is using less than the original properties did on septic. Less because the firehouse did not move, which took massive acreage and flow off the table, thousands of gallons, according to the documentation of what was expected to happen. It is worse than this because, as the MUA engineer mentioned during one council meeting, we never put in infrastructure in the ground for some of the original proposed properties. I do not have the actual numbers yet, as I'm still inputting them into our database, but it will be thousands more of missing flow. I would not be surprised if this ends up being a 60,000 plus shortfall in the town center area. Last, that missing infrastructure, it seems, includes part of Main Street. We actually may, it appears, have spent tax dollars to put sewer on private property, but did not in areas it was supposed to go, including the just mentioned Main Street. That opens the door to me, potentially, to a criminal investigation and question whether misuse of taxpayers' dollars or missing bond dollars occurred. Thank you.
Anybody else wish to step forward? Tom?
I almost said good evening. Good morning. My name's Tom McClackery. I just got a couple of quick questions, and perhaps Mr. Urson can clarify for me during his presentation. I realize the MUA is essentially a parliamentary organization, in that anything that it does, you're going to need 3 votes of those 5 people down there to do it. Is that me? Hey, I can hear. And so I'd like that clarification. Any action that they do to expend money or take action, they're going to need to do that with a majority vote of the MUA authority to do it in the form of a resolution. that supports the action that's going to be taken. So I'd just like to, if you have the chance, to clarify that. And my second point is 530, NJAC 531, that's the MUA budgets. And then 531 2.2 F, it says in here that except for the cost of preliminary plans, specifications, and estimates, no authority shall make appropriations, authorize expenditures, or adopt security agreements for a capital project. And my question in there is, this whole section of these regulations seem to refer back to the enabling legislation of the MUA and whether it has the ability to expend funds without the approval of the Vernon Council. And, you know, when I read this and I read the enabling legislation, it actually does. But if you could clarify that point, whether the enabling legislation gives the authority, VTMUA authority, the ability to expend funds without the approval of the council. And that's my 2 points. And thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation. I know it will be clear and concise. We ought to put it on TED. Thank you very much.
Is there anyone else wishing to step forward? There being none, I ask for a motion to close.
Motion.
Is there a second? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right. We have a discussion on the municipal sewer system. May we start that discussion? Mr. Urson, you want to make your presentation?
Sure. So the presentation this morning could take many forms. I'm prepared to give an overview of the important relevant documents, essentially going back to 2004, trying to highlight the key accomplishments of each document, perhaps illustrate some of the key reasons that the documents were entered into, and I am envisioning that along the way that this will give the council an opportunity to ask questions about those documents, or perhaps assign further analysis as the council sees fit. I'm starting the presentation with the direction of an overview and a review. I have not been given specific questions to analyze. I have not been given specific concerns to analyze, other than the fact that when the council addresses issues concerning the sewer, typically you have not had in front of you all of the relevant documents going back in time. And I know that a number of you have read some or most or all of these documents, and recently also been compiling some of these documents, but I'm hoping that this is going to be useful in that it will have historical continuity, basically back to the early 2000s up to the present time. So as I'm going through the history of this matter, what I'm going to try to do is give you reasons for these documents existing, try and give you some context as to the time and place where these documents were created. But I'm also going to try not to engage, except in response to questions. I'm not starting this with an idea that the purpose of this meeting or the purpose of your review is to go back and do a historical criticism of the decisions. Certainly, you know, you're going to hear me say many times throughout the presentation that many of these agreements were based upon facts, premises, predictions that certainly did not come true, and certainly have implications that continue to affect Vernon and this council today. The other thing, I think that you will recognize in advance, but I'll just point out, is I am specifically not trying to do an analysis or a review of the engineering issues presented. Obviously, we'll make reference to some of the physical issues concerning the sewer system in Vernon, and I'm also not going back and doing a historical financial analysis. We can certainly review the numbers and the obligations that are set forth in the agreement, but you would certainly need your CFO, your auditor, the MUA auditor, if we were going to really do a comprehensive review of the financial transactions that have taken place over time. So, saying that, what I will do is, with some of the documents, I'll make reference. I've provided the council with a set of documents, which is Exhibits A through H, which are the more important historical documents relating to the sewer system today. And as we go through, some I may draw your attention to certain pages in the documents, and some I will just make some generalized comments. So if we were going back and contemplating how we got to where we are, it starts in the early 2000s or perhaps earlier, and it starts with two concepts that were percolating in the town government back then, and this is my understanding from reviewing minutes, that there were two goals of the town at that point. One was to create a town center, and town centers were all the rage back then. There were a lot of zoning, grant, and development opportunities as a result of having a town center designation. And at the same time, it appears from the records that there was a big push from Mountain Creek, owned by Intrawest at the time, to push forward an aggressive agenda of development. And those two concepts appear to have moved in lockstep in the early 2000s. And the first documents that we have from those discussions are the financing agreements for the analysis. So if you look at Exhibit A is the sewer agreement between Vernon Township and Mountain Creek. But when we look at Exhibit A, this is a 2005 agreement. I would encourage you to go to the back of that agreement. In the back of that agreement is actually attached as exhibits, as the first two exhibits, is the two predecessor agreements. And the two predecessor agreements, and they're short, but they're both from 2004. You can find them as exhibits because they're way in the back. Last Exhibit A, figure last 10 pages or so.
Schedule A.
Yes. Nope. Schedule 1, that's it, one more page. And it's the first one's entitled Developers Agreement, Mountain Creek Resort, Vernon Township. Has much different font. It's a faxed page, and that is dated in let's see the date. That is dated mid-2004, and that is a financing agreement between Vernon and Mountain Creek, and it has to do with financing the investigation as to the viability of the sewer plant expansion and infrastructure construction in the Vernon Town Center. And then the agreement that is the sister agreement to that document is Schedule 2, which is dated a month later, and that is August 2004, and that is essentially the same agreement that is between Vernon and SCUMA. And that will parallel the next set of agreements as well. And I think when you look at these two agreements, the conclusion that has to be drawn by these two agreements is, in these agreements, it recognizes that Vernon as a whole was already serviced by 380,000 gallons of sewer allocation through the United Water System. And in this agreement, it makes it clear that the decision makers at the time believed that this 380,000 gallons was not sufficient, and that specific goals were identified. And this is the first place that I'm aware of in an agreement where the town center sewer allocation goal and the Mountain Creek sewer allocation goal appear. And you'll see them in both agreements, and you know these numbers. It's 99,000 for the Vernon Town Center, and it's 166,000 for the Mountain Creek property. And the other thing that I thought was interesting when you look at this agreement is the fact that in both of these agreements, there's a certain urgency set forth. There are time deadlines, and there are both time deadlines that are meant to keep this thing moving forward, but it is very aggressive deadlines, because if you look at Schedule 2, down at the bottom, where it says page 1 of 4, it actually says that the goal of this project was to have the construction and initiation of the operation of the project by December 31st, 2007. So I think when we're going back and looking at historical documents, you know, it's worth pausing on this agreement, because this is a turning point in Vernon. This is when the Vernon town government and Mountain Creek cooperatively decided that the 380,000 was not enough, that an additional 265 was required. Significant sums were invested in this Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, and the purpose is just the analysis of whether the system expansion is possible, and I presume whether it would be efficient and whether it would work. And when you look at it, you see the aggressiveness of it. And I think it's worth stopping and noting that is really explained by the financial climate back in 2004 and the early 2000s. And, you know, it was a boom time of development. There was a very clear thought process that this development was going to continue, and that Vernon would benefit from it. And as you know, by the time these agreements later on are all in place and some of this development is done, that development not only doesn't happen, but creates significant delays in the implementation of the system that you will see in a little while. And I will also mention that one big expenditure is set forth in these agreements, and that is the Herald Square acquisition. So the Herald Square acquisition was part of the due diligence in exploring the expansion of the system. And it is referenced directly in here that it would be a little more than $1 million acquisition, and that it was favored based upon the concept that the township would be getting a grant of $1.3 million, specifically referenced in this agreement. So that's the starting point in 2004. Then we would go back to Tab A, which is the beginning of the formal agreements. So Tab A then starts with October 2005. So it's a little bit more than a year later. The significant sums, hundreds of thousands of dollars, have been spent. Perhaps $1 million has been committed to the Herald Square project. And the township at that point decides to move forward with the agreement that you see here as the agreement between Vernon Township and Mountain Creek. And that agreement is the precursor to the SCUMA agreement. So the township had to make sure that its partnership with Mountain Creek was in writing, was complete, and then once that was put on paper, then the township could move to the agreement with SCUMA. And I went back and looked at some of the minutes of these meetings, and when we discuss sewer topics at regular council meetings these days, and I had the experience with the MUA obviously as well, any issues concerning the sewers today draws a lot of crowd, draws significantly different viewpoints. When you go back and look at the minutes from these meetings, there was not. There was a small number of people that came forward and commented on these decisions and these agreements going forward, and they were generally all in the same direction. They were all generally positive. And again, I think the point of the presentation today is to understand how we got to where we are, not necessarily to criticize past decisions. And I think that you have to understand, once again, the development climate at the time when this agreement was signed, which was all very positive, to the point where this agreement, given its size and future impact on the township, simply did not generate much controversy at that point. Maybe at other points it did, but at the point of adopting this agreement, it did not. So this agreement is very important because, to some degree, some measures, this is really the point of no return for the township in entering into the decision and plan to have a significantly expanded sewer system. To the point where, again, there's a preamble, and it makes crystal clear. It references the 380,000 gallons that was currently in the township through the United Water System. It makes it crystal clear that the key people at the time felt that was not enough. It makes reference to the extensive studies that was done. And then on page 3, it begins to set up the financial commitment that the township is still dealing with today. And these are just in the whereas clauses, but they're worth referencing. So it references on page 3 in the whereas clause that it was estimated at that time that the project cost to SCUMA would be $9.5 million. It references that the town infrastructure cost would be $4 million. And it's worth noting, because we're going to talk about it a number of times as we have this discussion, that these two dollar amounts formed the basis for what we sort of collectively and casually call the SCUMA bonds and the Vernon bonds. Those phrases continue to flow throughout the documents in these projects. But this $9.5 million, this was the beginning of what would become the SCUMA bond, and the $4 million is the beginning of what would become the Vernon bond. And it's interesting to note that there was an acknowledgement right in the beginning on page 3 in the whereas clauses that the total project cost for the sewer system would be approximately $15.2 million. So I think that, again, I'm not going to spend time talking about the engineering today, although this agreement begins to set up exactly what is going to be done with that money, the scope of the construction, what's all going to be involved. As I was looking through this document and noting interesting things in the document, I noted that this also brought up for the first time the role of United Water in the relationship between Vernon, the town center, SCUMA, and Mountain Creek. And it brought up in paragraph 2.05, it's worth a look and it's worth noting that an agreement as comprehensive as this, the first sentence in paragraph 2.05 is, at the time this agreement is executed, the parties are uncertain as to the role, if any, of United Water in the project. And that was a little bit of foreshadowing of a major problem that developed later on that we will get to and talk about. But the United Water problem that you're going to see develop essentially in about 4 years from the time period of this document, it wasn't as if that was a surprise to anybody. It was, they understood the question, they understood the problem, they just had not come to the answer at that point. I'll note one other thing while we're here too. I'm sorry to go backwards, but if you go back to page 8, there was definitely attempts by both the township and the developer is Mountain Creek, to put some financial controls on the project. And if you, on page 8, if you look at paragraph D, it specifically references that the developer has the right to object to any bid before it is awarded if the bid price exceeds $12.3 million for the SCUMA portion of the project, which is eventually will become the SCUMA bonds. And that's, that $12 million is a critical number, as you'll see later on. But it's just worth pointing out in this agreement that although there's a lot of talk about cost overruns and things being more expensive than predicted and so forth, there was attempts in these early agreements to control that. As you look further through this agreement, you will see that there's significant portions of this agreement on pages 13 and forward that were rights of first refusal and assignment restrictions. And I'm going to repeat this, and I'm just going to repeat it because I think it's just accurate. It was, these provisions are in here because at the time it was believed that the sewer allocation was so valuable that the parties needed to control who would assign it and whether it could be sold to other parties. Now, obviously, as we sit here today, that's just a different world, because today there is not a market for assigning or selling sewer allocation, and these provisions would not have been, or would not be very important today. But back then, again, it placed high value on the sewer allocation, believing that it was a marketable commodity and that it would increase in value. If we go a little bit forward to page 18, some of this is redundant, but we're gonna try and do this at an appropriate level of detail, and then we can ask questions later. But if you look in paragraph B on page 18, what's notable about it is that, once again, they were talking about the construction of this project, which was obviously very involved. They were talking about the completion of the project and where the allocation would go. But every time they did that, they were concerned about the timing. And so in paragraph B, they were focused on obtaining temporary capacity, meaning that in 2005, they didn't think, specifically Mountain Creek, didn't think that it could wait until the project was completed in 2009. It thought that it was going to need temporary capacity in the meantime, and so this whole paragraph under B talks about getting some temporary capacity so that projects could begin even before the construction on this project was finished. Flipping to the next page, 5.03. 5.03 is a critical paragraph, and 5.03, again, I don't mean this as criticism, because I'm going to try and stay away from that today, but in light of the history and the development of this project, 5.03 was a mistake. And 5.03 was a mistake because when the project was discussed, nobody stopped to consider what would happen if, when this project was finished, that the demand was not there to use it. And so that goes back to my earlier comments that at the time the developer was so confident that they were going to need all of this allocation as soon as it was finished, that there's provisions in here regarding the temporary use of allocation. This paragraph never took into account what would happen if this system came online, the bills came due, and there was no revenue. So, and that, we'll get to that in a little while, but that is exactly what happened in 2010 and 2011. The system came online, it was completed, Vernon started receiving bills, and there was zero revenue for the first year plus on this system. And so this was a major deficiency, which I think was created by the lack of understanding of the economic conditions 5 and 10 years later. The other thing that you will see in here that became problematic later on is paragraphs 5.06 and 5.07. So in an effort to be diligent, in an effort to address all of the possible scenarios, this agreement in 2005 started to try and cap both two things, SCUMA operating costs and Vernon operating costs. And these provisions might have worked okay if the system had been completed in just a couple years as originally envisioned. But when the system wasn't completed till 2010, these numbers, the SCUMA operating cost cap in 5.06 and the Vernon operating cost cap in 5.07, these numbers 5 and 7 years later were not very relevant and became a problem. We'll also talk about them later. And then the final thing I think I would point out in this agreement is flipping forward to page 21, in 7.02 and 7.02A and 7.02B, this agreement again was trying to predict what was going to happen in the future, keep some cost controls, and this agreement set forth a minimum connection fee of $1,000 and set forth a minimum sewer fee, sewer service fee of $1,000. And I think probably most of the council people are aware that when the system finally came online, at least through the MUA in 2012, these numbers were almost irrelevant. The connection fee was woefully inadequate given the acquisition of United Water and comparable connection fees around the county. And the sewer service charge was actually too high. That fee, if imposed to the users that came over from United Water, would have been extremely burdensome. And the majority of users on the United Water side do not have that fee, in fact have fees less than that. So that would have changed things. And you'll see later on, there was this agreement in 2005 was eventually renegotiated in some parts with Mountain Creek, and some of the things that I've just highlighted were the focus of the changes. So, Mr. Kadish, I'll take direction from you or the council, but I thought maybe when we got to the end of each either agreement or each segment of what we're discussing, I'd pause and see if there was questions from the council that I could answer before we go on to the next agreement and the next segment in the history.
For the benefit of the public should understand that every council member here and Mr. Bolker and the mayor have all toured this facility as recently as yesterday. And at that point, I was informed at least that the connection fees for Vernon are somewhat arbitrarily created, whereas the SCUMA fees are based on a factual formulation. And, I don't know whether that relates to this $1,000 connection fee or not, but,
Sure, so, and I'm also in this, there's a lot of minefields in this presentation, and I don't want to step on the toes of the MUA or speak for the MUA, because the MUA sets connection fees. So what I would say is that SCUMA has been one entity from beginning to end. Connection fees are related to the historical debt associated with capital expenditures, okay? So if you asked me whether SCUMA could calculate their connection fees with precision, I would think yes. In Vernon, you had a much more difficult problem in calculating connection fees because it was the debt service to the town center infrastructure, but at that time, it was also a historical perspective with respect to the United Water system, which not only was owned by United Water, but was created by another entity. And so calculating the capital debt service over the period from sometime in the 80s to now is difficult. So if you ask me whether it was created with calculated with the same precision, I think I might say no, but I think it would be incorrect to say it's arbitrary. And you have to understand the statutory nature of connection fees. The idea is that if someone joins a system today and begins to use it, the customer who has been attached to that system for 10 or 15 years, and as part of their rate paying has been to develop, maintain the capital structures, the capital infrastructure, that there should be a contribution to the system upon joining the system to account for the historical difference. Otherwise, someone gets a free ride by joining later in the cycle. I think that calculating Vernon's connection fee is more difficult because it's an amalgamation of different historical debt, and including historical debt of entities that some don't exist and some we have no relationship with. So I could understand someone saying that it's more difficult to calculate the connection fees in Vernon, but the word arbitrary would bother me.
well, my word.
No, or any
use it loosely.
inference. Yeah, any inference in that regard. And I think if you compared systems of a similar age in the county and their connection fees, I think you would find a pretty rational relationship.
I have a question. The initial 380,000 gallons of allocation, who controlled that?
Well, so back then it was the Great Gorge entity and then the United Water entity.
Was it available to use for the town center in Intralest?
So under BP, the United Water is a publicly regulated utility. Under BPU regulations, they would have had to do two things to service Intra-West or the town center. One is go to the BPU and expand their franchise area, and the second is amend the wastewater management plan to include that area. And the second thing was done in connection with this whole agreement. The first thing I don't believe was ever done, or was ever. I don't see that it was ever contemplated.
I have a question, or just clarification. So in this 2005 contract, any shortfall was supposed to be paid by Mountain Creek?
Correct.
So we wouldn't be left with any
Can you
deficit?
speak louder? I'm not sure they can hear you.
Oh, my question was to clarify that in this 2005 agreement, that Mountain Creek was responsible for any shortfall.
But you have to, it's yearly shortfalls of the operation of the sewer system.
So just operating costs.
Well, it's operating costs, so the shortfall would always, if you look at the formula that's set forth in 5.03 and you look at the formula that was later developed, one is, I wrote the second one, so I have an opinion about it, but the second one is much more comprehensive and much clearer. But when we're talking about the concept of a shortfall, it's not debt, its operating deficit. So that in any given year, the cost, the rates received from the ratepayers, when you subtract out the operating costs and debt, it leaves a shortfall. In the original agreement, there's a reading of 5.03 that indicates that the developer would be responsible for all the shortfall. Any other questions while we pause here for a moment? Okay, so we move to B. So once again, A is the first major agreement, which is, just looking at the date, October 2005, between Mountain Creek and Vernon Township. When you move to B, it is 1 month later. And 1 month later, having secured the financial agreement between the partnership between Vernon Township and Mountain Creek, the agreement between Vernon Township and the Sussex County MUA was finalized. And this agreement, I presume, it's actually dated up top May of '05 and was signed in November of 2005. This agreement is much more straightforward, less moving parts, less negotiation than the first agreement. And the reason is that the Sussex County MUA is made up of 6 or 7 members who are contracted to get service from the Sussex County MUA. And the MUA, to some degree, and certainly more in the present time, works to standardize its relationship between it as a receiving sewer district and the members who are sending to them. So this agreement was probably done and on paper, certainly because it's dated May '05, until the financial situation between Mountain Creek and Vernon Township was worked out. And the agreement largely mirrors the agreement that SCUMA has with its other member contracting parties. So if we were just going through and looking at the highlights of this, I would just draw you to 4.02 to start with. Lots of this agreement is devoted to the formulas that SCUMA uses to charge rates, the procedures it uses to adopt its budget and so forth, things that are very standardized along the way. When you look at 4.02, it talks about what the annual charge to the township will be. It gives the formula. In B, it talks about the way it develops the ratio between its member contracting parties. And in 4.02C is the first major thing that's unique to Vernon. And this is critical to your understanding of your system, which is when you contracted with SCUMA to expand its plant and develop infrastructure, Vernon Township was requesting an additional 265,000 gallons of allocation, and you agreed at that time that you would pay for it all. That's a critical thing to understand, that your maximum allocation was 265,000 gallons. Your minimum billing amount was 265,000 gallons. And we're going to talk much more about that later on. Moving ahead to 406B, there's something else unique that was developed with respect to Vernon that will play a role in multiple agreements as you go forward. In 406B, there was a rate stabilization fund that was created. And the rate stabilization fund allowed you to take 60% of the connection fees that are paid to SCUMA by each user connecting to the system, and to take those fees, put them in a fund, and then apply them as you see fit to stabilize rates over a given period. And that's very significant, because what this represents and what this acknowledges is this was not done in other places, but here, Vernon and the developer fronted, either directly with cash contributions or by bonding, fronted the vast majority of the construction costs of this system expansion. And as a result of that, the connection fees that SCUMA would normally be entitled to itself and would normally use for its own budget, it was negotiated that 60% of those would go to benefit the ratepayers in Vernon as they connected. And that was important, because it clearly acknowledged that when the system was new, regardless of the perceived demand for development, when the system was new, the first customers that were being connected to the system would be unfairly burdened, disproportionately burdened. When you take the cost of operating a sewer system and you divide it by your number of users. So on day one, when the first user connects, his rate's not going to be too good. So that's what this clause was referencing. And then in 409B, this references the debt that was created to improve the infrastructure both at the plant and in the ground to transmit. And you will often hear that the SCUMA bonds that the township is continuing to pay to today, and that are burdensome and are going to be a big problem, that you will continue to hear these referenced as either SCUMA bonds, or you'll hear them referenced as 409B bonds. And the 409B reference comes from this section because it sets up what those bonds will be, and the schedule of those bonds appeared attached to this agreement, but appears in later agreements as well. So the rest of this agreement really goes is very standardized language that has to do with the rules and regulations of the operation of the SCUMA system. And there's less that's unique or interesting about Vernon going forward. So I'll pause there for a moment. Once those two agreements were done, your partnership with Mountain Creek as a developer going forward, and the finalization with SCUMA of the expansion of the plant and all the infrastructure construction that had to be done, once those two agreements were signed, the project moves forward, okay? And it moves forward in ways, there's a gap in the documents that we're here talking about, and the gap in the documents is the construction period, okay? So there were references in these documents that in 2005, there were thoughts that all this construction would be done by 2007. It wasn't. I'm not going to analyze that for you here today. That's really a different question. But it was completed, I will say completed more towards the end of 2009. So as we flip in the book from Exhibit B to C, there's a 4-year gap, and that 4-year gap was the construction period. So I'll just pause a moment there before we start talking about what happened in 2009. Anybody have questions about where we are now?
Yes, the rate stabilization. Is there a limit to that?
The rate stabilization limit is the connection fees up to the 265,000 gallons. So if you figured out, and actually, I would actually say something a little further, the amount is unknown, because today it's based upon 60% of SCUMA's connection fee, but the connection fee changes, it goes up, and you might not exhaust that rate stabilization fund and the benefit under the 60%. You might not exhaust that for 5 years or more going forward. So the exact amount, it can't be determined. No other questions? Okay. So again, the time period from the end of Exhibit B in the end of 2005 going forward brings us to 2009. Now, in 2009, I think, again, I wasn't here, but I sense that what was happening is that folks realized that the construction on the sewer system expansion was proceeding and was nearing an end. And the foreshadowed reference that the role of United Water was uncertain, I think came to the forefront in 2009, in 2008, I'll say. Because in 2008, the council started discussing the role of United Water and started discussing whether or not it would be advantageous to purchase the United Water system. And in 2008, there was both a physical and a financial study done of the United Water system to determine if it should be purchased. And my impression is in 2008 and the bulk of 2009 that it was a hot topic of debate, and that the council and other stakeholders could not decide whether to do it or not do it, meaning buy it. So the reason this decision as to whether to buy United Water could be important for a lot of reasons, including the customer base, including controlling all of the allocation in Vernon Township. But one of the reasons that something had to be done is the Vernon Town Center system was not connected to the SCUMA infrastructure. And there was a section in the middle that was owned and controlled by United Water. And so they were essentially, if you did nothing, they were going to become the middlemen in a system where the contractual relationship was supposed to be between Vernon, Mountain Creek, and SCUMA on one side, and in the scenario that you had, United Water was in the middle. So in this, I think even looking at this date, December 23rd, 2009 is the service extension agreement between Vernon and United Water. And I view this agreement as the proverbial putting your finger in the dam to stop the leaking. The council at that time, it appears, could not decide whether to buy the United Water system. Something had to be done because the system was about to be completed. The town center and developer were not connected to the SCUMA infrastructure, and something had to be done with United Water. So this agreement is interesting in a couple of respects. There's a lot of talk in here about the project. There's a lot of talk in here about Vernon absorbing all of the costs of United Water and entering into this transaction. Maybe we could flip to page 9 first. So in doing this, if you look at the top, one of the things Vernon took on in this agreement is Vernon took on the cost of relocating and replacing sewer company's pump station number 1, which I'm pretty sure is the Sand Hill pump station. So in this agreement, because you needed United Water and because they were the middleman, you were willing to take on the relocating and replacing of their pump station, which is would have been a very significant expense. If you go just 3 pages later on page 12, in 3.1 it gives this very comprehensive definition of what the payments from Vernon would be to United Water, and you're essentially reimbursing them for legal costs and approvals, inspection fees, filing permits, and the list goes on and on and on, and to the point where there's even a markup. You're reimbursing them all of their costs and then 20% extra markup. So that just shows you the relative bargaining positions of Vernon Township and United Water at that current time, which was that the township really had to agree to whatever United Water wanted at that point in order to fix this problem that you were not connected. And then what I think is the most interesting aspect of this agreement is, as you read this agreement, it's typical with a lot of these agreements, as you get to page 17, it then pours over into miscellaneous, the kind of stuff lawyers make their living on. And there's page 17, 18, 19, 20, miscellaneous, all lots of uninteresting stuff. And that continues and continues all the way to page 25. And on page 25, the most important paragraph in this agreement, which is 25 pages long, is buried in the last paragraph. And the last paragraph, 5.22, informs Vernon that because they're the middleman, and because, I wasn't there, but presumably because they're holding the cards, they are now going to charge you as a bulk customer for every gallon that flows through them to SCUMA. So here you have, you and Mountain Creek, Vernon Township and Mountain Creek, have paid all of these costs, all of this development cost. You have a good idea what your costs are going to be in being customers, and it turns out that because you have a middleman, you're going to have to not only pay SCUMA what you were expecting, but you're going to have to pay United Water as the middleman. And I don't know exactly what those costs would be, but back in 2010, I certainly heard estimates that they would be six-figure costs. So that is an important aspect of that agreement, and that brings us to 2010. Does anybody have a question about where you were at the beginning of 2010 with United Water? Okay. So one thing that I did not put in this book, somewhat on purpose, is in 2010 and 2011, what was happening at the time is that the system was completed. By my memory, it was certified as completed in either the third or fourth quarter of 2010. In 2010 and 2011, you began receiving bills from SCUMA with no customers. And those bills, I'll give you the exact number in a little while, but the first year it was perhaps $150,000. By 2011, it was something closer to $650,000. And you're receiving those bills with no customers. So the council at that time was running hard to catch up, was looking at all the options, and identified the fact that United Water was the middleman in this, an unintended middleman in this transaction. And between tabs D and E in the book that I gave you, the council in March of 2011 enacted Ordinance 1105, which was to make application to purchase the United Water system. And the idea in doing that was, I'm sorry, it's between Exhibits D and E. It's not, there's no reference to this in the book. I did not include this ordinance in the book. And the reason I didn't is because the United Water contract is bigger than this book. The United Water contract was, you know, classic lawyers. It was more than an inch thick, and I just did not include it in this book. But it's important to note the timing. So this agreement that I had referenced in C, which was a fix the middleman problem at the end of 2009, when the new council took over in 2010, this was a source of debate, and the plan that was created at that time was to buy the United Water system that would accomplish the problem, solve the problem of removing them as a middleman to remove the cost of that bulk tariff. The second thing would be to control all of the sewer in Vernon as one whole unit rather than separate pieces. And I think you might see later on in this presentation, and hopefully later on in history, that has certain advantages. So in connection with, and again, I'll just, since I don't have it in the book, I'm just going to emphasize the date. That agreement was entered into in March, or at least the ordinance to make application was March of 2011. The next thing that happened is that the council began to consider what would happen once you owned the United Water System. And once you owned the United Water System brought up the issue as to whether you should create an MUA. And so in deciding to create the MUA, the philosophy behind that, and the philosophy, first of all, MUAs are statutorily authorized. They're authorized all within one town. They're authorized as joint operations between two towns, and they're authorized as regional or county entities like SCUMA. If you know, the chapter regarding creating utilities is interesting because it gives a lot of the legislative history and purpose in creating an MUA, but the essential, core essentials of creating the MUA is the fact that in a new sewer system, essentially a baby sewer system, there was going to be an enormous amount of work to get that system up and running. The council takes its authority over that sewer system and gives it to the MUA as a delegation of doing all of that work. The second thing is that sewer issues are inherently difficult, and being difficult, the statute, the legislature specifically gives you the option of setting up the MUA so that elected officials are not making these decisions, but appointed officials, and the idea is that they be politically insulated from these decisions so that hopefully they make the best decisions and not have to worry about re-election in making those decisions. At the time that you applied to create the MUA, it was also a time when the Christie administration was very focused on MUAs. Frankly, you could Google it, but it was a time when the Passaic Valley Sewerage Authority was under a tremendous amount of scrutiny, and there were very significant issues there. And so when you applied to DCA, if you actually look under 528.3, which is a reference from your ordinances, the local finance board would not approve your new MUA unless you inserted the clauses that the MUA members would not be paid, that there would be a certain amount of Oprah-type disclosure, including a website, and that there be an anti-nepotism policy. Again, addressing some of the issues that authorities were having on a statewide basis. Also in just referencing the creation of the MUA, a couple of the questions that came up, the question with respect to parliamentary procedures, I think those procedures are generally defined within the rules and regulations of the MUA itself. I'm not sure I can shed too much light on that. I think I can help with the second question more, which is whether or not the MUA is entitled to expend funds on its own without the approval of the council, and the answer is clearly yes. The MUA has the authority to contract, has the authority to expend funds. There has been different interaction and discussions between the MUA and the council about perhaps the MUA needing the council in the future with respect to sewer expansion. But that's more a question of the bonding capacity of the authority and less of its authority to spend money. If the MUA had significant bonding capacity, they would not need council participation in a future expansion. So that created the MUA and brings us to E. I'll pause there for a moment because the last segment that I've just discussed were two pretty significant steps. The purchase of the United Water System to create one unified system within the town, to remove them as the middleman, and the delegation of your authority to an independent, autonomous agency, the Vernon Township MUA. Anybody have questions there?
I do. When the initial bills started coming in, and there was no one to pay for it, who paid those bills?
The township paid those bills.
So the taxpayers paid those bills in early 2010, 11?
Well,
Or, yeah.
yeah, so the taxpayers paid those bills, but when we get to the next document, Exhibit E, that Exhibit E was the reconciliation between the MUA and the township so that the MUA absorbed all of those costs that had been expended by taxpayer dollars.
So in effect, the township was repaid by the MUA.
Not in effect, actually, yeah, 100%. And keep in mind that if you had not created the MUA, you would, in your ordinances, you would have to create a municipal utility that the council would run. And if you created a municipal utility that the council ran, it would be the same requirement. Those costs would have had to be self-contained in a separate utility budget that would have to be self-liquidating with respect to ratepayers. Any other questions at the inception of the MUA stage? So once the MUA was created, the MUA went to work and spent about a year holding public meetings, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice a month, creating all of its rules and regulations in preparation for having customers. So they had bills, they had a mandate, but they had no customers. So the first year, I think almost exclusively was rules, regulations, procedures until they had customers. That fast forwards us to at least the beginning of the point where they would have customers, which is Exhibit E, which is the interlocal agreement between Vernon Township and the Vernon Township MUA. And this is dated December 12th, 2011. And this agreement specifically begins to reconcile and assign responsibility for some of the financial aspects of the sewer system. And so it's a short document, but it gets right to the point. It specifically endorses the United Water purchase. It endorses Bond Ordinance 1122, which created a $4 million fund for the purchase of United Water. It endorsed a Bond Ordinance 1123, which created a $2.8 million fund, which was used for different purposes by the MUA, including the carrying costs of getting it to the point where it had customers, ratepayers. If you go to the second page, there's actually an accounting, and these are the exact numbers that I referenced before. Under paragraph 7, it actually accounts for the costs that Vernon Township paid, being the $120,000 in 2010 and $697,000 in 2011. In paragraph 9 and 10, it accounts for some bond ordinances that had been previously done for sewer expenses that had remaining balances and some legislative grants. And essentially the idea behind it was that it would create a reconciliation and a roadmap for how the finances were to be conducted between the MUA and the township. And in this agreement, it's important to note that $2.8 million because that was specifically put in there as a fund that the MUA would begin to draw on up to, as a carrying cost maneuver, up to the point where they had ratepayers either by the acquisition of the United Water System or by the connection of users within the town center. Okay, I'll pause there for a moment.
And it's from that 2.8, the township recovered its costs that it had originally fronted?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, yeah, and I
It
you
has
know,
been
more,
paid back, is he saying? Are you saying it's been paid back? Is that what you're asking?
It continues, that, it comes from that particular fund. The 2.8 million. Yeah.
it's my understanding that that accounting has been accomplished and that it is paid back, but that's a question you could address to the CFO as well, as to how that's accounted for in the books.
So there's, the amount from that 2.8, well, some of it was paid prior, and some of it is continuing to be paid, but it's all accounted for on both books as a due to and a due from, and that bond is available to pay the costs, to make sure that the MUA is covering the costs for debt service to SCUMA. So it is being paid back.
But you're still drawing from it at the
Yes,
same
we're
time?
still drawing
From
from
the
it.
same time, right. So it has not been paid back completely to the town.
I would have to check, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe.
I think the town's been paid back, but the bond hasn't been paid back.
Right, the bond has definitely not been paid back yet.
Any other questions? Okay, so we move to Exhibit F. Exhibit F is a financing agreement between Vernon Township and Mountain Creek. I think this is a very critical document, and I think is very critical to understanding the development of where you are. So when this essentially, the first major agreement that you do is in 2005 between Vernon Township and Mountain Creek, and that is essentially the partnership agreement that gets the whole ball rolling, so to speak. As I pointed out when we were looking at the 2005 agreement, the 2005 agreement made significant assumptions based upon the development demand and the time that it would take to complete this system. So when the system was becoming, when the system was essentially living and breathing and had ratepayers and was understanding its finances, we began to look back at the 2005 agreement and started to see the shortcomings of that agreement. At the same time, Mountain Creek was coming to the table and addressing the fact that all of this development that these original agreements thought was going to happen between 2005 and 2007 still had not happened as of 2011, 2012, and it was a major problem. It was a major problem not just for Vernon, it was a major problem for Mountain Creek, and it was a major problem for the partnership between Mountain Creek and Vernon. And so we began to negotiate with Mountain Creek regarding their obligations with an eye to what would be in the best interest of the township, and at the same time attempting to address some of the concerns of Mountain Creek. So when we look at this agreement, I think that you have to understand that this agreement got Mountain Creek to recommit with more precision, with more teeth, with more detail to all of its commitments than had been in the 2005 agreement. And I personally view this as a little bit of a watershed moment, because there could have very well been litigation at this moment. The 2005 agreement had certain assumptions, and when those assumptions didn't happen, this moment in 2012, Vernon could have either sat down at the table with Mountain Creek and come to an agreement that worked for both Vernon and Mountain Creek and moved forward with firm understanding and firm commitments as to what both parties were going to do, or it could have begun to litigate. And that was clearly on the table. The finger pointing that would have happened as a result of the delays in the construction, the missed projections, the financial cost controls, etc. I will guarantee you that if this had gone to litigation in 2012, the case would still be going on. I guarantee it. Because it would have been the life or death of Mountain Creek at that point. Because these obligations were so significant. And in the meantime, the obligations that Mountain Creek had simply would not have been paid, because that's where we were. Okay? So in this agreement, I'm just going to run through some of the highlights of it. In this agreement, on page 6, in paragraph 2.02, the agreement that Vernon Township was going to take on with respect to the Sand Hill Pump Station, we negotiated that Mountain Creek would take on that responsibility. That was a major cost, and through subsequent negotiations, I know even to this day, those development plans for this pump station continue, but Mountain Creek has been paying the cost of maintenance and upgrade of that pump station in connection with this agreement. Let me just flip.
You're the second person that was crazy.
In 5.01 was a critical negotiation. 5.01 was the heart of the disagreement. So because the original 2005 agreement never contemplated that this system would come online in a situation where the bills came due and there was no revenue, no one ever thought that was possible. The big ticket item on the table during this negotiation was whether or not Mountain Creek was responsible for all of the 2010 and 2011 shortfall, or none of it. And that's the heart of what was going to be the fight. During the negotiation, the decision was made and then subsequently ratified by the council that the responsibility for the shortfall should equitably be related to the proportional ownership of that allocation. Throughout this whole agreement, the partnership between Mountain Creek and the town center was always about a 63%, 37% division, with Mountain Creek having 63% of the allocation. And so when we looked at the monies that had come due in 2010 and 2011, we needed an agreement that they would be paid. And the negotiation was that they would pay 63% of that shortfall as being equitable. And I'm aware that the 2005 agreement implied that Mountain Creek would pay 100% of the shortfall, but I will just tell you that the definition of what that shortfall was really, really lacking. And there was going to be a significant issue about whether it was intended to apply to a situation where the bills came due and there was no revenue. So this is a major component that Mountain Creek agreed to pay the $636,000 as referenced in 5.01. The second thing was that Mountain Creek recommitted to paying all of the costs of the Vernon bonds. That was a major factor because that was, that would have been an enormous problem for the town if Mountain Creek continued to either not pay, be late, or have other problems with respect to the Vernon bonds. Getting them to recommit to pay the Vernon bonds was, I think, a big accomplishment of this agreement. And in the times that I've heard it referenced, from this point forward, I think the Vernon bonds were paid pretty timely, and I think they're paid up to date currently. And Elka's shaking her head yes, so that's good. If you look in 5.04, 5.04 is a restated method for calculating the deficit and surplus calculations that were in the original agreement. I think if you compared this definition to what was in the original agreement, this definition works, this definition has procedures, this definition has detail, and I would submit that the other one does not. It's interesting to note, and this is available to members of the council, it's available to the public, but in 5.05, one of the procedures that was set up was that in each year, Vernon Township, really the MUA, sends notice to Mountain Creek certifying the amount of deficit from that year. And then there's a procedure set up to finalize that amount or an appeal process. And to my knowledge, that notice has been sent every year. There's an accumulated debt from Mountain Creek with respect to this deficit, and I don't think it's been appealed in any of the years either. So the other thing, turn to page 11, 6.01. The other thing that happened during this time period was that it was becoming very clear. This was the inception. This is 2012. This is when the sewer system is coming online. It became clear that once there was hookups in the town center and the United Water customers became Vernon customers, that in the short term, the MUA and the system would be financially okay. And just as an example, a debt service that is currently in the $400,000 to $600,000 range and goes to $1.5 million in the future, in the first couple of years of the sewer system, the debt service was $150,000. So we negotiated the next provision very closely in connection with the auditor for the MUA, who really felt that the MUA was going to be financially okay in 2014, 2015, 2016, and it was the time period, perhaps starting in 2017, where there could be financial problems. And so what this did was it gave Mountain Creek a 5-year deferral of the amounts that it was supposed to pay, both in the amount it committed earlier, the $636,000, and the deficits from each year. That amount was deferred for 5 years. It was very much deferred because of the representations of the development problems, development economic problems at Mountain Creek, and the assurances that the development would get moving and would move forward in the future. And so what it did is it took those debts and had them begin to be repaid in March of 2017. And just as an illustration, this is a critical provision, and it's in sync with the MUA debt and MUA financial issues going forward, because at the time this agreement was done, the debt service to SCUMA from the MUA was, I think that year, $150,000. And that $150,000 increases to $600,000 in 2017 and increases to $1.5 million in 2023. So between the ratepayers coming online, the rate stabilization fund from the connection fees, it was thought that this 5-year deferral could be accomplished both for the benefit of Mountain Creek and really in the best interest of the MUA with this money being deferred through a 10-year time period where the MUA was certainly going to need it a lot more. So that was a key component. And if you turn to 8.02 and 8.03, we also use this agreement to fix the projections from 2005 with respect to connection fees and sewer service fees that were just wrong from the 2005 agreement, because it was just simply too early for the 2005 agreement to adequately predict them. So this is the agreement that brought the agreements between the township and Mountain Creek up to the point where they are today. And some of the schedules that I've made reference to before, if you look at the back of Exhibit F, there's Schedule A and Schedule B there. Schedule A is somewhat interesting, but it's really just a recalculation of the fees that Vernon absorbed in 2010, 2011, payable to SCUMA. Schedule B is more interesting and has more relevance going forward. This is the Vernon bond payment going forward. And this is the Vernon bond payment that that Mountain Creek had been paying, continues to pay, and continues to pay all the way up until 2033. So let me pause there for a moment. That is the financial agreement that updated the 2005 agreement between the township and Mountain Creek. Does anyone have questions about that? Okay. So in a similar fashion, once the township bought the United Water System, you had two separate systems operating in town. So I'm on Exhibit G now, and Exhibit G is a restatement of Vernon's 2005 agreement with SCUMA. And the idea behind this agreement was that it would create a single system with respect to the Vernon Township SCUMA relationship rather than two separate relationships. And this agreement, I think, was extremely advantageous to Vernon. And the reason why is, as I told you before, the 265,000 gallons that you had contracted with SCUMA, your minimum payment was the maximum flow. So that every person you add to the system, you're not really gaining anything there. You're still paying the 265, okay? So by combining the two systems, we were able to fix a mandatory minimum by combining the 265 you had and the flow that was going out of the United Water System at the time. And by combining those two numbers, we created a minimum flow. So when you combine the two maximum allocations of 380 and 265, that gives you the 645 in maximum allocation. The 645 maximum allocation, we were also able to create a minimum flow number of 461,000. So that means that every customer that you add to the system now moves you towards that minimum number without adding more cost. You're paying the 461 no matter what, but you move towards that without paying additional cost. If we had not done this consolidation, when you added customers on the United Water side, you were paying on that side on a per gallon basis. Every time you added a customer, you would have been adding cost. You would have been running in place. Rather than moving towards a minimum flow that's efficient, you would have been running in place. So the fact that it fixed a minimum flow is very beneficial to the township. The other thing that it did is it allowed us to take credit under the rate stabilization fund, the 60% of the SCUMA fee. We could now take that anywhere in the township. And so there was one example that's easy, and that is when the urgent care connected, we got 60% back on the rate stabilization fund, and without this agreement combining the two districts, that would have been under the old United Water system, and we would not have received the credit for the 60% of the connection fees. So just in those two areas alone, creating one system is better. It's more efficient. It creates one bill, one contractual relationship between Vernon and SCUMA. But the creation of a minimum flow amount and applying the rate stabilization fund rebate to the whole system will have significant benefits going forward.